You know that feeling when your hands won't stop shaking, even after you've finished working? Not from the cold, not from fear, just from exhaustion so deep it lives in your bones? It, 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 it. I know that feeling well. I knew it every single night for 2 years, standing in the parking lot of a grocery store at 11 o'clock watching the last cars pull out, wondering if my back would hold out long enough to finish mopping the entryway before my shift ended. I was 71 years old, and my son had been lying to me for 3 of them. My name is Donald. I spent 34 years working for a logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. Not a glamorous job. I managed warehouse scheduling, handled inventory disputes, made sure the trucks went out on time. Unglamorous work. Honest work. Number 3. Honest work. The kind that leaves calluses on your hands even when you're sitting at a desk, because the weight of responsibility has its own way of wearing you down. I retired at 68. My wife Carol had passed 2 years before that ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and after she was gone, the job felt like the only structure keeping me upright. But my knees had other plans. My lower back, which had been sending me warning signals since my mid-50s, finally staged a full revolt. My doctor sat me down in October of my 67th year and told me very plainly that I needed to stop before the stop was chosen for me. So I retired. I had a pension. I had savings, 41 years of careful, deliberate saving, because Carol and I had grown up with parents who remembered not having enough, and that memory becomes inherited. We never took lavish vacations. We drove sensible cars. We paid off the mortgage on our house in Westerville 12 years early. By the time I retired, I had just over $310,000 in a savings account, plus my pension payments coming in monthly. Not wealthy, comfortable. More than comfortable, honestly. Enough to live quietly, help out the grandkids at Christmas, maybe take a train up to see my sister in Michigan once a year. That was the life I had planned for myself. My son Marcus was 43. He lived 20 minutes away with his wife Stephanie and their 2 kids, Jalen and Ava. I loved being close to them. After Carol died, Marcus became my main anchor to the World Sunday dinners, baseball games with Jalen, helping Ava with her science projects. I was the grandfather who showed up. That was my whole identity in those years. I was happy with it. Marcus worked in marketing. He was good at it, creative, persuasive, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like he'd been waiting specifically to meet them. But he was also the kind of man who believed, deeply and without question, that his next idea was always the one that would change everything. He'd had a few of those ideas over the years. A food truck he'd planned with a college friend that never got past the napkin sketch phase. A real estate investment group he joined in his 30s that quietly dissolved after 18 months. I never said anything critical. Carol had been the one to gently pump the brakes on Marcus when he got like this. After she was gone, nobody filled that role. In the spring of my 69th year, Marcus came to Sunday dinner with what he called something serious to discuss. Stephanie was quieter than usual. The kids were sent to watch television. Marcus spread some papers across my kitchen table, projections, floor plans, a logo design, and told me he wanted to open a restaurant. Not just any restaurant. A premium casual dining experience in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. Farm-to-table menu. Craft cocktails. Laughed. A private dining room available for corporate events. He'd already talked to a chef. He'd already scouted a location. He had a name. Harrow and Stone. I listened. I asked questions. I told him it sounded like a significant undertaking. I told him the restaurant industry had brutal failure rates, and that he had a family to think about, and that I'd feel more comfortable if he went in with a business partner who had actual restaurant experience. Marcus nodded at all of this. He said he understood my concerns. He said he'd thought about everything I was raising. He said he wasn't asking me to invest. He just wanted to share the dream with me. I should have heard the difference between what he said and what he meant. 6 months later, I noticed something wrong with my savings account. I want to be precise about how I discovered it, because the way it happened still makes my chest tight when I think about it. I wasn't even looking for anything suspicious. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon in November, trying to figure out why my property tax payment hadn't cleared yet. I logged into my bank account to check the balance before calling the county auditor's office. The balance was $87,000. I sat there for a long time looking at that number. I refreshed the page. Same number. I clicked through to the transaction history. Over 11 months. There had been 14 separate transfers. Out of my savings account, the amounts varied $8,000 here, $22,000 there, once a single transfer of $35,000. They all went to the same external account. An account I didn't recognize. My hands were not shaking yet. That came later. In that moment I was simply very, very still. I spent the rest of that afternoon making calls. My bank confirmed the transfers had been authorized, that is, they'd been initiated online, from my account login, with my credentials. They asked if I wanted to report fraud. I told them I needed to make one call first. I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, cheerful, asking if I was coming to Jalen's basketball game on Saturday. And I said, very quietly, Marcus, I need you to tell me about the transfers from my account. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. He drove over that night. Stephanie stayed home with the kids. Marcus sat across from me at that same kitchen table where he'd spread out the floor plans for Harrow and Stone, and he told me everything. He'd gotten my login information 2 years earlier. I'd asked him to help me set up online banking when Carol first got sick, and I was overwhelmed with everything else. He'd written down the credentials. I'd never thought to change the password. He hadn't touched the account for over a year after that. Then Harrow and Stone started needing capital. His business loan came through, but it wasn't enough for the build-out. His investors pulled back. He was $224,000 short of what he needed to open, and he'd been watching my savings account sit there, and he told himself this is the part that took my breath away. He told himself that I had more than I needed, and that he would pay it back before I ever noticed. Once the restaurant started making money, he said he was going to tell me. He said he'd been meaning to tell me. He said he was sorry, Dad. He said it in the voice of a man who has been caught, not the voice of a man who was carrying unbearable guilt. I asked him one question. Is the restaurant open? He said it had been open for 4 months. He said it was doing well. I asked him why, if it was doing well, he hadn't paid me back a single dollar. He said he'd been reinvesting the revenue into the business. He said that's what you had to do in the first year. He said he'd planned to start repayments in the spring. I nodded. I told him I needed him to leave. Here is what Marcus didn't know. I had noticed something wrong with my finances 8 months earlier. Not the specific transfers, I hadn't looked closely enough to catch those, but a general wrongness, a sense that my cushion was thinner than it should have been. My pension covered my basic expenses, but there were moments when I found myself hesitating before small purchases in a way that didn't match what I thought my balance was. I'd mentioned this to my daughter-in-law Stephanie once, offhandedly, over the phone. I'd said something like, I must be spending more than I realize. I thought I had more put away. Stephanie had said, oh, I'm sure it's just inflation, Don. Everything costs more these days. She knew. I don't know when she found out. I don't know if she knew from the beginning. But she knew, and she let me sit at her dinner table every Sunday for months, watching me tell her children stories about their grandmother, and she said nothing. That second realization, Stephanie, was the one that actually broke something in me, because I could build a story around Marcus that made a terrible kind of sense. He was reckless and self-serving, and he betrayed me in a way I will never fully forgive, but I understood the shape of it. I understood how a man could convince himself of a lie if the lie was convenient enough. What I couldn't understand, and still can't, is how a woman could sit across from her children's grandfather and watch him not understand why he felt poorer than he should, and say nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window where Carol used to read, and I thought about what 71 years on this earth had taught me, and I made a list of my options in my head. The first option was to absorb it, to let Marcus pay me back on whatever timeline suited him, say nothing publicly, protect the family's surface appearance of normalcy. This was the option I think Marcus expected me to choose. He'd seen me absorb things quietly my whole life. He'd watched me take care of Carol through 18 months of illness without ever making anyone else feel like a burden. He knew I was not a dramatic man. The second option was to do something about it. The next morning, I called an attorney. His name was Gerald Watkins, and he came recommended by a man I'd worked with at the logistics company, a man who'd gone through a contentious estate dispute with his siblings and said, Gerald was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words or your money. Gerald's office was on the east side of Columbus, modest, lined with filing cabinets, a fish tank in the corner that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a while. I liked him immediately. I laid out everything. The transfers, the timeline, the amount, Marcus's admission. Stephanie's silence. Gerald listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and asked me what outcome I wanted. I told him I wanted my money back. I told him I wanted a legal record of what had happened. And I told him that I was not interested in what was comfortable for Marcus. I was interested in what was right. Gerald explained my options clearly. Civil suit for financial elder abuse was one. A formal demand letter, with a structured repayment agreement, legally binding, was another. 1. And he recommended starting with the demand letter. It was faster, less expensive, and in his experience, when adult children realized their parent had hired an attorney and was prepared to go further, repayment agreements tended to materialize quickly. He also said something I've thought about many times since. He said, Mr. Patterson, I've handled a lot of these cases. The money is important, but the reason people come to see me is usually because they want to stop feeling like what happened to them was acceptable. The legal process helps with that. He was right. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday. By Friday, Marcus had called me 4 times. I didn't answer. Gerald handled the communication. By the following Wednesday, Marcus and Stephanie sat in Gerald's office. Stephanie had found her own attorney, which told me everything about how she viewed the situation, and we negotiated a repayment agreement. Full repayment of $224,000, with interest, over 30 months. A lien placed on Harrow and Stone as collateral. Legal documentation of the unauthorized account access. Marcus cried in that meeting. He told me he was sorry. He told me he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd panicked and convinced himself he could fix it before anyone got hurt. He said, Dad, I wanted you to be proud of me. I looked at my son across that conference table, and I searched myself for what I felt, for the anger I expected, for the grief, for the love that I knew was still somewhere underneath everything. What I found was quiet. Not peace exactly, but quiet. I said, I know you did. And I turned back to the papers in front of me. Here is something nobody tells you about being betrayed by your own child. The hardest part is not the money. I know that sounds like something people say, like a greeting card sentiment, but I mean it practically. The money was recoverable. It said 30 months, and it would be back. My pension still covered my life. I was not destitute. The money was not the wound. The wound was the 2 years of Sunday dinners. The birthday parties for Jalen and Ava, where I'd sat at the head of the table, feeling quietly honored, not knowing I was being watched like a resource rather than a grandfather. The phone calls where I'd told Marcus I was proud of him for pursuing his dream. The night I'd helped him practice his pitch for his investors, sitting in this very living room, genuinely wanting him to succeed, not knowing the investor he'd already secured was me without my knowledge or consent. That was the wound, not the number in my bank account. The 2 years of theater. For a time after the legal agreement was signed, I found myself retreating. I turned down Sunday dinners with a series of polite excuses. I stopped going to Jalen's basketball games. I went on long walks in the mornings, through the neighborhood, past the houses of people whose names I barely knew, just to be outside and moving and not thinking about any of it. My sister Ruth drove down from Michigan. She stayed for a week. She didn't ask me to talk about it unless I wanted to. She cooked dinner every night and we watched old movies, and she told me stories about our parents I'd never heard before. Small, dignified stories. The kind that make you feel connected to something longer than your own life. That week probably saved me. Slowly, I found my way back to myself. I want to tell you something about that because I think it matters. I did not find my way back through forgiveness. I want to be careful here. I know what people expect me to say. That I eventually understood Marcus's desperation. That the love I had for my son and grandchildren was larger than what he'd done. That I found peace in releasing the anger. Maybe some of that is true, somewhere, in some form, but that's not what brought me back. What brought me back was simpler. I decided that what happened to me did not get to be the definition of the last chapter of my life. Marcus had taken 2 years from me, 2 years of quietly worrying about money that should have been sitting safely in my account, 2 years of being deceived at my own table. I was not going to give him any more years than that. I started doing things I had always told myself I'd do after I retired. I took an Amtrak train to New Orleans in the spring and spent 4 days eating food that Carol would have loved and walking along the river and talking to strangers at breakfast. I signed up for a woodworking class at the community center, something I'd thought about for 30 years, and discovered, to my genuine surprise, that I had some talent for it. I started building a bookcase for my living room, then a coffee table, then a set of bookshelves for Ruth. The repayment checks came every month. I deposited them without ceremony. The balance in my savings account climbed back toward where it had been. I stopped checking it obsessively, and that, I think, was the real sign that I was recovering, not that I felt better, but that I stopped needing to verify the wound every day to make sure it was still there. I have seen Marcus 3 times since the legal agreement was signed. Once at Jalen's middle school graduation, where we stood on opposite sides of the gymnasium and nodded at each other across the room. Once at a cousin's wedding, where we shook hands and said the things you say and moved on. Once, and this was the unexpected one, when he showed up at my door on a Sunday morning in February, alone, no call ahead, just standing on my porch in the cold, looking like a man who had driven over before he could talk himself out of it. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat at that kitchen table again. He didn't say much that I hadn't already heard. But he said one thing I hadn't, that Stephanie had known from the beginning, had actually been the one to suggest using my account when his loan fell short, and had talked him into believing it was borrowing, not stealing. He said he'd taken the full weight of it in that conference room because he felt like he deserved to, and because he was ashamed that he'd let his wife's voice override his own sense of what was right. I didn't say anything for a long time after that. Then I said, "Marcus, I'm your father. I have loved you since before you could breathe on your own, and I will love you until I'm done on this earth. But I need you to understand something." I paused. "What you didn't just cost me money. It cost me 2 years of trusting my own instincts. Every time I felt something was wrong and told myself I was imagining it, that was you. You made me doubt myself. That's the part I'm still working on." He nodded. His eyes were wet. I said, "I don't know what we are to each other now, but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen to make you feel better. And I'm not going to carry it forever to punish you. I'm going to do what I should have done with a lot of things in my life. I'm going to let it be exactly what it was, and then I'm going to keep going." He left about an hour later. He hugged me at the door, a long, uncertain hug, the kind where neither person is sure what it means. I stood on the porch and watched his car pull away, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not closure, not the warm rush of reconciliation you see in movies. Just the quiet again. That same deep quiet from the night I sat in Carol's chair. And this time it didn't feel like numbness. It felt like the moment after a long storm, when the rain stops and the air is still and everything that was standing is still standing, and you realize you made it through. I went back inside. I had a bookcase to finish. Jalen's birthday is in April. I've already bought his gift, a signed baseball, a player he loves, somebody Carol would not have recognized but would have pretended to know just to see him light up. I wrapped it last week. It's sitting on the shelf in my hallway, next to a photograph of Carol and me on our wedding day 43 years ago, both of us young and slightly terrified and completely certain we were making the right decision. She was the right decision. 34 years of the right decision. I think she would be angry at Marcus. Genuinely, quietly furious in the way Carol got furious, which was scarier than any raised voice. But I also think she would tell me to go to that birthday party. She would tell me to watch Jalen open the gift. She would tell me that the children are not responsible for what their father did, and that a grandfather who disappears is a loss nobody heals from easily. She was almost always right about things like that. So I'm going. I'll sit at the table. I'll eat the cake. I'll watch Jalen's face when he sees the baseball, and I'll be grateful that I am 72 years old and still here to see it. And I'll know, in the way you know things after you've been through something that changes the shape of you, that I did not let what happened to me become who I am, that I fought for what was mine, that I did it with evidence and documentation and a good attorney and without screaming at anyone, because that's who I am and that's who I intend to remain. Friends. If you're listening to this and you know something is wrong, if something in your gut is telling you the numbers don't add up, the story doesn't hold, the people around you are a little too eager to reassure you, trust it. Don't wait for the proof to find you. Go looking. And when you find it, don't absorb it quietly to protect everyone else's comfort. You've already spent a lifetime taking care of other people. Take care of yourself. That's all I've got.